Well, it's no question that the world is changing socially, politically, and economically. And with the U.S. and the West economies not as robust as they once were, and emerging economies such as Brazil, Russia, India, and China rapidly growing, geopolitics will likely look much, much different than it does today. But what exactly will the new world look like? Many predict it will be a world where the West no longer dominates. But one author takes it a step further. Author Charles Kupchan predicts a future very different than anything you've heard before, one that's focused more on diversity than dominance. And he details it in his new book, you see on your screen there, No One's World. And he joins us now to talk about it. Welcome to the show, Charles. So you talk about this coming global turn. What direction is the world headed?
Well, I think 300 or 400 years ago, the globe turned in the sense that its center of gravity moved from the Mesopotamian Valley and Asia north and west to Europe and North America. That pendulum is starting to swing again. But I don't think it's swinging to China or Asia. It's not going to be a Chinese century. I think it's swinging everywhere and therefore nowhere. And so for the first time in history, we will be living in a world that is interdependent, globalized, interconnected, but no longer dominated by the West. And that's why I think it will be no one's world. We don't know when that moment will come, when there is no longer a material and ideological hegemony of the West, but we know it's coming, and we better prepare for it.
And so are you talking kind of like the near future or decades from now or any idea? I know you said you don't know exactly when, but any scale of that time frame?
Sure. I think we're at the beginning of the end of a 200-year period of Western hegemony that opened in 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and will begin to move to the new era over the next decade or two. And that's because you look at the numbers. China will surpass the United States in global GDP sometime in the next decade. Soon we will have a three-currency world: the Chinese renminbi, the euro, and the dollar. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, will roughly equal the industrialized world in about 15 years. So we're starting into that period of change. We will be deeply into it within about a decade.
Now, you say that there won't be any centralized power given to any one country. But today we can look at a country like China, which clearly is rising politically and economically. We see their economy exploding and growing so rapidly. So why wouldn't you point to perhaps the shift heading towards a country like that?
Well, I think that the debate here in Washington recognizes that the power is changing. Where I think we are just beginning the conversation is on the ideology. What does that mean? And we've been living in a world where I think people thought there was one road in history, the Western road, and everyone would end up looking the same. And now I think we're starting to see different paths: a Chinese-Russian path, more state capitalist; a political Islam path in the Middle East; a populist path in Latin America. And I think the Chinese will do very well, but they will not globalize their world, in part because they have assets others don't, in part because they're not democratic, and so they won't catch on. And it's for that reason that I think no one will dominate. It will be a world without a global guardian.
Now, it's pretty clear that we are seeing this economic shift, but I know that you argue that that you're not convinced that Western ideals of democracy and secularism and capitalism, you don't think that those ideas or those ideals will necessarily spread either.
Well, I think that the West rose in a unique way. It was very much about the rise of the middle class. It was about the Reformation that pushed the church out of state. It was about a secular brand of nationalism. And when I look around the world, I see countries taking different paths, their own paths. So if the West was born by its middle class, China's middle class is being integrated into the state. It is not the vanguard of democracy. In the Middle East, there hasn't been a reformation and probably won't be a reformation. That means that mosque and state are deeply intertwined. And it's those kinds of deep cultural and historical factors that lead me to believe that the 21st century will be a century of multiple modernities, not everyone converging toward the Western way.
Now, do you think the West will let this happen? Because let's say, for example, we see what's happening with the rise of the power of China. And now the U.S. is responding to that by shifting their military strategy. We see more bases kind of opening up surrounding China. So do you think the West will let this happen?
I think it's important that the West understand it's happening. Because if the view remains that the Chinese, the Turks, the Indians, the Brazilians, the Russians are all going to dock at our harbor, that is to say, play the Western game, I think we will end up in a very difficult and competitive world. If the West realizes that it needs to compete respectfully in the marketplace of ideas with others, then I think we may well see a 21st century that's much more cooperative. So the key is recognizing that we're at the beginning of this big change in history, big change in the world, and figuring out how to rebuild consensus and compromise with rising powers.
So now you say that this world is going to be one that is more diversified. There won't be really one clear world power. So with this in mind, should the U.S. then stop demonizing countries like China as kind of this evil communist power and just accept it as, you know, a country that is different politically, and we should just respect that difference because, as you say, our ideals of democracy and capitalism won't necessarily spread to the rest of the world?
Well, I think the United States has always been a country that tries to broadcast its ideals, and it should and will continue to do that, but it needs to do it in a different way. It needs to stand by human rights and stand by democracy, but nonetheless to grant that there are other versions of responsible governance and responsible governments. And in that respect, I think we should speak out about political repression, speak out about violations of human rights, but not treat as illegitimate countries that do not practice our kinds of politics. That more pluralistic and tolerant statecraft, in my mind, will lead to a much safer world.
Now, I'm hearing all this, and it does make sense to a certain extent. But just speaking from my own experience, doing some traveling to other countries, third world countries, you can still clearly see the influence of U.S. culture. I'll just take something like the Philippines, for example. Mm-hmm. You see McDonald's, you know, everywhere. You see little kids singing Justin Bieber and, you know, things like this, pop culture, mm-hmm. but still kind of that drive to be like America. So it's clear that that separation isn't there at this point. So what's your response to that?
Well, you know, I think it's important to distinguish between the appeal of American culture, America's soft power, and the readiness of other countries to follow the American model and the American way. And when I travel to countries around the world, whether it's in South Asia or East Asia or Russia or Latin America, I see countries that aspire to certain aspects of American culture, but are also interested in and desiring of following their own paths, building their own kind of modernity. And I also think it's important that the United States today, along with its partners in Europe and in Japan, are in a rough patch. Our economies are in neutral. Our political institutions are stumbling. And that means that when emerging countries look out at the world and say, whose model works, the answer sometimes is the American model, but sometimes there are alternatives out there that are doing well. And that, I think, is going to add to the diversity and pluralism that I see coming around the corner.
So we may see different cultures, more of a mixing pot of whatever works for a particular country.
Yeah, that instead of a end of history, which was what people were pronouncing 15 years ago, I think history is getting more interesting. History is getting more diverse. And that's not necessarily bad, as long as we recognize it and go with it and see diversity and pluralism not as a threat to the Western way, but as something to be capitalized and even celebrated, and to build a new cooperative ethic amid that pluralization of power and ideology.
All right, Charles, very interesting. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
That was Charles Kupchan, author of the book No One's World.